attitude, but his good friend, Aaron Burr, soon to be Vice President of the United States. That is the building of the Farmers Free Bridge. That is the Farmers Free Bridge looking west in 1902. Part of the Broadway Bridge can be seen to the distance on the extreme left. I don't know if we can make it out on this one. The Kingsbridge Hotel is along the bank just to the left of the two men. That's that big building. This is a hotel. Again, all of this is filled in. Up there, that one, the white one. All of this is now filled in. Very close to where we were. Well, now, here comes up a very interesting fellow, Louis Ricci. Jump a little bit. He stands before a street map of the section of the Bronx that was annexed to New York City in 1874, again, west of the Bronx River. It shows the route of his, yes, somebody actually designed the Grand Concourse and Boulevard, its original name. This is his map. This is the man. He was a self-trained engineer, and a wonderful engineer at that. What made the Grand Concourse so unusual was that they had transverse roads, very similar to what you see in Central Park. They go underneath the park. That was a very unusual idea. So where were these transverse roads? Some of you lived by them, perhaps. You definitely walked through them. Well, 161st Street, 172nd Street, 70th Street is a big one. You know, you go up the concourse and you'll see all these transverse roads going underneath the concourse. This was a big deal to do at the time. It was a very interesting idea. Now, they're doing this for horses and horse and buggies, not for vehicles that we know later on. These particular things, this etching, for example, you see there are just horses on it. But you see the construction actually could work very well for everybody as it progressed, because they set it up to be that. This was originally a speedway to get down into Manhattan, a quick way. But this was actually etched by Louis Ricci in 1892. So already they were thinking ahead about how they would manage things. Louis Ricci, again, was the chief engineer for the Topographical Bureau, and again, the acknowledged designer of the Grand Concourse. This is a pen and ink drawing of the complete concourse. Again, this was done, it's called a bird's eye view, 1892, but it was designed this way. When you look very close at this, it illustrates many of the conditions at the time and it proposed improvements. South to the left and north to the right. You understand? So here we are up north, right here. So you see odd things here. What is that? It's a racetrack, 1800. Then down here, there's another racetrack. In fact, the Bronx had 3 racetracks at one time. 3, something very big. The Morris Park racetrack, which is not shown here. It was a very large racetrack, and it's where the Belmont Stakes got started. Back. All of Morris Park right now. How many people live in Morris Park? Anybody? Morris Park is it's built over the Morris Park Racecourse. And I mean, it was a beautiful, beautiful place. Beautiful place. You can see, of course, the Hudson River in the background there. I'm sorry, the Harlem River and that little steamship coming up. And now you're starting to see some additional bridges. Of course, the first bridge that went over, that was of any nature, was, of course, the High Bridge Bridge, okay, which was the water bridge. I always like to ask this question: how many people walked across the bridge or utilized the bridge as a kid? How many of you actually went inside the bridge? Because you know there's a big 7-foot pipe in it. Well, you can go in there. It was closed off. It has been closed off since 1962. The High Bridge Aqueduct Bridge, which, by the way, is located. Give you an idea. So it'd be around University Heights. So it'd be right around over here. What's the mark? No, right there, I'm sorry. That's the High Bridge right there. The High Bridge is the oldest bridge in New York City. Masonry bridge, except for the center, which was removed once they established that the river could take big traffic. They had to take the piers that were located in the waterway, and they put an arch there, the steel arch that you see there. But between the steel arch and the walkway on top is about 8 feet. And in there is a pipe. And that's what fed Lower Manhattan. That's part of the water system in New York City. But the water system was stopped in '62. That part of the Croton system was stopped. And then the bridge was closed because somebody threw a paint can on a big paint can, onto the Circle Line. and the Circle Line plan is shut off the bridge. There are plans to reopen it. It is a special viewing of the city. It's very high, well over 120 feet above, the waterway there. It really is some view from the top. Okay, let's continue. Now, of course, it's very bucolic here in our borough at times. Very bucolic. What makes it bucolic is because there are very few people. Very, very few people. Get that page, we know where we are. And the way in which this works is for people to know that the borough of the Bronx was made up of a lot of small little towns interconnected. It's a farming community for the most part, at least in the early part of the 19th century. It wasn't until the latter part, when the Germans started to come in, where we now see, businesses, real businesses. At one time, the borough of the Bronx had 19 breweries, something like 28 piano factories, just to give you an idea of the strength. The whole South Bronx, the area that became this term for the worst of urban America, was actually one of the best and most commercially active areas, with factories of all sorts for, well, probably almost 100 years. And then it stopped. But that's true for all of New York City, in fact. There's very little that New York City produces anymore, which is a big problem. We need factories. We need things here. We want to make our air better. We should be utilizing all of our rooftops, put greenery up there. Let's put solar cells, solar panels. The world is ours. Science has made it possible. While I'm telling you about the birth of the Bronx, from 1600 on, there are men above 240 miles above us, traveling around the earth. They broke the bounds of the earth. They're up there. They're living there. Well, how do they live there? They have what's called solar power. They also have hydrogen cells. One day, soon, we'll have that. We'll be operating right out of here. This building is a green building, for example. They're planning for what to do with things. So, the Bronx was always the front of quite a bit of the act of science and of things. Some of the first telephones, for example, in New York City were in the Bronx. And just so you know, it was a doctor that had the first telephone. Phone number 1, phone number 2, phone number 3 were doctors and a business, which of course makes sense. That's what it should be. Continue along. There's a lot of construction going on in the borough. Huge amount of construction. What you see in this construction is lots of people working. It sort of reminds you now of how China must be, right? All these people working constantly, fixing up the borough, where in the city of New York, things don't last very long. In the borough of the Bronx, we have only 4 historic house museums that have any age. The oldest building in the Bronx is what?
Museum.
What?
Museum.
Van Cortlandt Mansion, 1748. The next oldest is the Valentine Varian House. The Historical Society runs that. That's where the Museum of Bronx History is, 1758. The next one after that is Edgar Allan Poe's cottage right up the block here, about 1812. And then the Bartow Pell Mansion, which is about 1820s. Then you have other buildings that go along, but when the destructions came and we had the fires going through the borough, well, those houses couldn't stand up, so we lost a lot of things. The wooden buildings would happen anyway. Stone ones, perhaps. If someone cares for it, their house. Most interesting thing that happened during the fire times, which were the 70s in the lower Bronx, is that it would expose. You have all these big buildings torn, burnt out, and then fell down or be brought down. And then behind it, you'd see these other buildings that had not seen the light, at least of the public people, going through the streets for many, many years. Some of them still stay. Some of them manage to stay. You can still see them when you walk or travel. When you travel with us on a tour, for example, of Morrisania or wherever else we'll go. Keep in mind, we're also building subways at the same time in the latter part of the 19th century. This gentleman here is Gouverneur Morris. Lost his peg leg there. He lost his leg in a horse accident, and for most of his life, he was a very young man. He did it. This man was the penman of the U.S. Constitution, meaning that it's his hand that wrote the U.S. Constitution. He was also a fervent anti-slavist. He was also the man who started the Erie Canal. He was also the man that helped to establish the grid, the perpendicular grid system, which we're all very thankful for, in the New York City area. He signed the U.S. Constitution. In our borough of the Bronx, we have two major figures. Lewis Morris, his half-brother, who signed the Declaration of Independence, and then Gouverneur Morris. Everybody thinks it's Governor Gouverneur Morris. Penman of the Constitution, who signed the U.S. Constitution. Both of them are buried in St. Anne's Church, down on 44th Street, St. Anne's Avenue. And we have occasional tours down here to look at the crypts. A wonderful man. He also looks, both in body and feature, just like George Washington. The thing about it is, if you go into City Hall, there's a statue of George Washington. When you walk right in on the right side, that's actually the body of Gouverneur Morris and the head of George Washington. That's a little tidbit for you. The next time you ever go in there, you take a close look. Well, what have we got here? A man standing on cobblestones. Now, why would you put cobblestones on streets? Macadam is just coming in. Well, cobblestones last. That's the big thing. They don't have that much concrete. They don't think in terms of that. The use of concrete came much later on. But they had too much, they couldn't deal with dirt streets because when it rained, it got too muddy. It was, people would go into the quagmire. There's stories of what it smelled like. It was unbelievable. We think, we have dirty streets. We have no idea what it's like. None whatsoever. South Street Seaport for many years used to have a tour. I brought a class down there once, and they're giving the tour, and they're showing what they call the Mews, M-E-W-S. It's behind these five-story walk-ups. And it's very beautiful, and the fellow who's leading the tour is describing the bookstores over there now, and a little store to buy food. It was wonderful, beautiful. He had no idea what they actually were used for. The Mews, in fact, were nothing like beautiful things. It's where the garbage was thrown. So while there was a five-story walk-up, in fact, they had like 3.5 stories of garbage before they actually pulled it out. Forget about the rats. They looked like lions. They were so big. They had all sorts of creatures inside and around because that's what people did. Now, think about horses for a moment. What do you think horses do? Do you think they clean up after themselves? Think the Scooper Law works back then? No, no, no. This town smelled, but everybody's town smelled. Everything smelled. It's just the nature of it. It's why it's easy to have plagues. Very easy when you destroy your water. That's why we had to get a fresh, pure water system, which we did for the Crocus system. I like this shot because it shows the foreman up there pointing out, he's got his blocks, and they're gonna right to the right of him, as you see, they have brick as well. And they're redoing streets. They're constantly redoing the streets because the borough of the Bronx was one of the best places to be. Now, what is happening on the waterway? Today you look at the waterways and you don't see very much because we don't utilize our waterways that much. Except in the change in the last 15 years, the Imperiali family, who established, decided that they want to be the Vanderbilts again. The Vanderbilts are the ones who established the ferry system in the 1830s and 40s. Well, the Imperatelli family established the ferry system again over the Hudson. And all those ferries that you see now, and by the way, there are ferries, I was on South Street Seaport 2 nights ago, and there's an announcement, they have water taxis. And the water taxi at South Street said, okay, come on board, we're going to Shea Stadium. Going to Shea Stadium, buy water. Wonderful. Now I find out at Fort Lee, or Edgewater, they actually have trips to Yankee Stadium on the Hudson River. They go all the way to the, wonderful. You want to utilize as much as possible our transportation needs. If you can cut 1 to 2% of people going over the great bridges and under the tunnels, the Hudson River at least, this is a big deal. Get more people, we should have dirigibles. We should have ways to get people around easier than we have today. So when we look at these scenes of people going around, going through the great waterway, you say to yourself, well, it must have been always this way. Well, in fact, in 1524, Verrazano came here for the French. And he came through the Narrows, and the thing he wrote to his Dauphin, who later became the King of France, he said, the most amazing thing, we thought we're coming into an unknown land, and the lower Hudson, as far as he could see, was filled with boats. This is 1524. What were the boats? The boats were the Indians' boats. There he saw two-man canoes, one-man canoe. He said he saw one that looked like 50 men were in it. Imagine the size of that. The size, the sheer size. The Indians didn't think of the waterways as obstructions. That was their highways. That's how they got around. They understood this. So what we have here is a situation where, as transportation evolved, at the same time we have the loss of our ability to produce stuff, right? So we have less need. So if you look at the Hudson River today, and what you'll see a couple of banana boats maybe going up to boats filled with bananas going up to the Albany area, the Albany port, or you'll see maybe some oil freighters or something like that. But basically, other than those new ferries, the waterways are empty. Some pleasure crafts come around, but for the most part, it's one of the great harbors of the world is empty. Amazing. It's an amazing fact. That doesn't mean we don't still have a tremendous amount of commercial doings in Brooklyn, in Red Hook, in Jersey. We have a lot, but it's really a remarkable thing that this kind of scene is not visible much anymore. No show about the Bronx complete without our Edgar Allan Poe, the great man of letters who lived right off the block here. Edgar Allan Poe lived for only 40 years, 1809, 1849. This is a real picture of him, by the way. Look at that flyer. Yes, he was melancholy. Yes, he was haunted. He had a difficult life. His poor wife died very early of consumption, which is TB. She was his first cousin. Married her at 14. He is a Southerner, a Southern gentleman. He had no real formal education. He went to the University of Virginia. He was thrown out for gambling and supposedly drinking. He went, by the way, to West Point. Many people know that. He went to West Point because he had been a sergeant in the Army down by Fort Moultrie in South Carolina. And that's where he wrote Gold Glove, for example. This man is a titan in the English language. He's read more today than he was when he died. Because when he died, he pulled the ultimate trick. What was the ultimate trick? He named as his executor a person who absolutely despised him. And that is why, to this day, people think of Edgar Allan Poe as he was a drinker, he was a plagiarist, he was a drug addict. All of that came out within days of his death. It was like the ultimate joke of Edgar Poe. By the way, Allan was something, he never actually officially had it, but he called himself that. The Allens were the people that adopted him, but never officially adopted him. This man was an extraordinary force. To read his poetry, he called himself a poet. How he made a living was to try and sell things. The Gold Glove sold for like $20. $20. Annabelle Lee, $15. Immortal poems. Can you imagine that? So how did he make a living? He wrote for literary journals. Eventually became the head of a number of them. He was a scathing critic of everybody else. He was quite something. And he died going back down to the South on a lecture tour. That's what he did. He lectured on the poetic principle, on writing, on the people of the day. Edgar Allan Poe lived up here in the Bronx for 4 years. He died before he came back, and his mother-in-law, who was also his aunt, eventually closed the cottage up and went down south. But people knew he went there, and almost immediately, Poe's name became very well known in Europe, and people would travel here just to visit Poe's last home. Eventually, a dentist took it over, the Poe cottage, and he put out a little sign. It said the Raven was here. It's a picture of where the Raven is on. But he didn't write the Raven. He wrote it in Philadelphia. Eventually, they moved it to a park, the cottage I'm talking about. They moved it to a park that had already been established by the Shakespeare Society, called Poe Park. And they moved the cottage over, and they placed it facing, well, at least on the northern end of the park, facing a bust that you now see, a bronze bust, inside the cottage. With a head, if you go in there, you see that head, it's really quite something here. You know how there are people who have little heads and big heads? I once went to a chiropractor, I asked, how many people have heavy heads? You know, you think that'd be a good question to ask. She said, you know, quite a few people have very heavy heads. But she said, that's not the funny part. The funny part is when you have someone who has a very light head. And like you feel like you have to be careful. Well, this guy supposedly had a big head and a heavy head at the same time. He was all head. He had a little diminutive Anyway, the point about Edgar Allan Poe is when you step out of here and you go see the Library of America, which is this wonderful attempt by Library of America people to establish all the great writers in the English language, specifically the English language, of American writers. Okay? And there are 2 books in the series, Poe's books. This man died at 40, and yet there were 2 major books of what he wrote. You know, back when, everybody was writing to each other. Those who were erudite enough, they would write to each other. Now, just for our young ones here, there's no telephones, there's no emails, there's nothing. There's, hey, Bill, come on over here. This is what it was. There was no telegraph in the 19th century, of course, but that cost money. And no one had money. It's not like the norm. Nobody had the kind of money. So people had more time, and they were able to do more. I think the bane of our society today is the fact that people just watch too much television. They just, and the kids are on screens too much. They gotta be outside, they gotta be doing stuff. We have a society today where there's more information available than in the history of the world. And yet, people know less today than they know a generation ago. When I give a tour, if I walk out of this building, in fact, I can give a tour, you can blindfold me and stick me somewhere, even in Jersey. In fact, I know Jersey right immediately. You take the blindfold off, I can smell it, I know where I'm going. I talk about the trees. I talk about the macadam. I talk about what the bricks are made of, why buildings are built a certain way, about architecture. Well, you can't do that if all you ever do is watch television. Now, many of you are nodding, you understand. This is a difficult situation. We're in a world with computers, and it's just so much easier. But the problem is that people actually believe this stuff, that this is the ultimate. That every book that's ever been written in the history of man is available now on the web. It's just not true. It's less than 5%. You need librarians to still work your way through the shoals of information. Now, my wife is a philosophy professor. She says it's the most amazing thing how kids cheat by going on the website and just going, plugging in, they want to do something on Plato, right? And they come up, and 6 of them will have the same article. They just pulled out. They won't even change the top. I mean, it's so, they're oblivious to how to even do this right. And so you end up in a situation where we have to understand, this man was an accomplished man of letters, astounding man of letters. But all of us could do that as well. Our brains are capable of doing everything. What we're not capable of doing is allowing us, because I believe, we're not capable of allowing ourselves to just become mush. And that's what's happened. We're all allowing ourselves to go down, not up. A fellow once applied for a job with me, for an education position. This young fellow came in, and the reason why I brought him in was because he wrote on his references and his letter to me, was that he had exceptional knowledge. I'm always looking for people with exceptional knowledge. I brought him in. I said, this is just great. Now, tell me what your exceptional knowledge is. You can already see he's starting to sweat. You know, because I'm a Bronx man, I collect exceptional stuff. God, give me a little stuff. Let's just go something off the way. Give me the 7 wonders of the ancient world. He couldn't name one. He couldn't name one. We can name one, right? Name one. Thank you. But let's get the one that everybody knows.
Pyramids.
Thank you. Now, why is that important, the 7 wonders of the ancient world? It's because there is a tradition that goes back and forth. Education is about universality. It's not just about thinning it down so that people know only one thing, like how to do the computer. This man invented the detective short story. Guy de Maupassant said, he is our father. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the great Sherlock Holmes, this was taken off of him. And the Murders of the Rue Morgue. All of Sherlock Holmes comes out of this man's big, heavy head. Perhaps this one too. This is Mr. Breen, Mr. Martin Breen. Mr. Breen helped to establish, because they had to, once the city took over in 1895, the greater city, the Manhattan Island section took over New York City's western section, they found that they had all this land in what was to become the Bronx, but they had no roads, they had no sewers, they had nothing. So he pushed to really get the annexation and then to help an unknown feature. Green is P-R-E-E-N. The Valentine Varying House. This is now one of the sites of the Bronx Historical Society. As I told you, there are 4 historic house museums. This is one of them. The Polk Cottage is the other that the Historical Society runs, Bronx County. This particular building was built in 1758. Also had to be moved across the street, a national landmark on Bainbridge Avenue and East 408th Street. It's one of the few national landmarks in the entire country that was moved to a parking lot as opposed to being torn down for a parking lot. We have a little garden. It's about 2/3 of an acre. We have our high school, Bronx High School Valedictorian Awards program there every year. The tent over the garden. The garden is only about this thing. Underneath is macadam, because it was a parking lot. We love this place. There are exhibits all the time. There's one going on right now on the Bronx African American History Project, which you might be interested in finding out. We're open Saturdays 10 to 4, so it's Polk Cottage, and Sundays 1 to 5. Let's take a look at this particular picture now. You see the field directly in front of you. If you look to the left, what do you see? You see towers. All of a sudden, you're seeing wires. Well, are those wires for, telegraph, perhaps? But they're probably also for telephone. Electricity is not coming through yet. Remember, electricity is a later thing that's occurring. Later, beyond even the telephones and before the people getting electrification. In the biography of Lyndon Baines Johnson, he talks about the sections of, when he grew up, sections that didn't have electricity until the 30s. Well, many parts of the country did not have electricity until the 1930s. That's what the TVA was all about, in the mid-area. So here we have, the Bronx was one of the first to have all these kinds of things, but it still had windmills. Look at the center. This was a windmill. And the windmill part is off. But that was a windmill in some of the Morris estate lands. This is a very interesting place. We're seeing a lot of development at the same time as we are seeing how people develop themselves, what to do, how to get themselves set, what's going to happen next. This is a very heady time to be in the city of New York. A lot of action, a lot of stuff. But keep in mind, people will live that way. I see a hand. Is that a hand?
I'm just wondering if you know the name of the road that runs up.
We do, and when I find it, I'm going to tell you. When you write too many books, you know what happens? They all start to mush together. I like that word. And when I do, I'll let you know. It's called the Morris Indian set. Anyway, so we see the farm. I'll come back to it later. This is another one of the people who established the borough, helped to establish the borough of the Bronx. We'd like to go give a couple of pictures of different people because nobody knows anybody. Here is Edna Mae Doherty, who was part of the Ferris family. Went back four centuries, the Ferris family. They were big in Westchester, in the Westchester Square area. All of the women were teachers. They had something like 8 generations of teachers. All women and teachers. Look at that dandy. You don't have his name. You don't know his name, but that's what he did. That's what he'd wear in the summer, by the way. Remember, we have all these shots of people in the summer, the deepest summer, the hottest time. They're all wearing their, cravats and they're wearing vests and it. He's a wool. Oh, he's not. You get used to stuff. That's what life is. You get used to stuff. People say to themselves, well, how is it possible that someone could live without air conditioning? Is this what it comes down to? You get along. I mean, does everybody have to live in Florida? No. And those that went, take care. But when the air conditioning goes, boy, they're really going to be upset, aren't they? Because it's hot down there. It's humid down there. This actually area here is very good. And when it really gets hot, go over to the Bronx River. Go into the Botanical Gardens. The breeze comes right flowing down the gorge. It's a wonderful scene. Here is another development of housing and of showing you an area. I think this is like 168th Street. The way in which this development goes is that it always goes from the south north. At the same time, they're starting to place the trains in. And so we have, this is the late 19th century or 20th century, we start to develop the train system. And so for the first time in America and in Europe, especially in Europe, you'd have train connecting from one place to another place, from one town and village to another town and village. In New York City, we actually connected it from the main part of New York City, Lower Manhattan, and we just shot a line up